Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second panel in the first day of the Weapons in Society conference. I'm Dr. Bennett, the Research Manager at the Royal Armouries, and I'm delighted that you can join us today. This is the second instalment of the conference. Its predecessor took place in 2019. Believe it or not, in those days, we actually did things face-to-face, put everyone in a room and spoke to one another, which seems hideously outdated now. But the point of the conference has remained the same, which is to provide a venue for discussion and networking for people studying for postgraduate qualifications, people starting their academic careers, independent scholars, people who are simply interested in arms and armour, and people working in the heritage sector, the museum sector, and in the case of this panel, actually the commercial sector too. The conference is organised by the Royal Armouries, which is the UK's national collection of arms and armour, in collaboration with three bodies responsible for funding doctoral studies: the White Rose College of the Arts and Humanities, the Heritage Consortium, and Northern Bridge. We're really grateful for their support and thankful to everyone who's put in time and effort to make today happen, as well as to you for attending. Now, the current panel covers the significance of swords and those who bear them, which is a topic very near to the museum's heart. Our sword collection ranges from bronze swords made in Germany 1,000 years BCE to Anduril, Glamdring and Sting from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings series. Now, as always, we'll have our two papers and then a question and answer session afterwards. However, feel free to ask questions throughout the panel using the Q&A function on Zoom or the chat function on YouTube, and I'll pose them to the speakers after the event. So with the necessary preparation out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce the first of our speakers today, Eric Wagner. Eric is a researcher and cataloguer in Morphy Auctions Firearms Department, with twin interests in arms and armour on the one hand, and the formation and reformation of social memory on the other. Now today, his paper looks at the phenomenon of naming weapons in the context of memory and authority. So Eric, over to you.
There we go. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. Let me share my screen here so everyone can see that. As Dr. Bennett said, my name is Eric Wagner. I have an interest in authority, and today I'd like to talk about named weapons, in particular weapons that have a unique identifier. I'm not looking at why something is called a broadsword or a falchion. I'm looking at something that is associated with a particular person or is uniquely identified by itself. What you end up seeing is that there are really three distinct phases of naming. And what you see is that in each of these phases, the name does a different thing and will draw on different areas and authorities in order to justify either its own existence or its wielders. Let's see. So this first phase it's a mythological past, it's legends, and it focuses on individual authority and the magnification of an authority that's intrinsic to the wielder. You're not going to see this come up. They're not borrowing power from anywhere. They're not going to try to justify their actions through some other kind of authority. It's all intrinsic. And generally, when the wielder either loses the weapon or dies, the weapon more or less disappears from the written record or vastly weakens the wielder. In phase two, is when you're going to start seeing an outside authority. And when this starts to come into play is when societies are more interested in having a ceremonial handing over of power, this peaceful transfer of power. You're going to see this when people want to use outside authority to justify themselves. We'll hit a couple of really great examples in the Middle Ages for that one. And then the third phase, and the one I'm most familiar with, is a modern phase. And it's really late 19th century, where the collecting of arms and armor becomes much more prevalent, especially in the private sector, and especially during the interwar years and after World War II, where authority is actually almost completely stripped out of the weapon. And what you end up seeing is a sort of verbal shorthand for people who are in the know and people who are not in the know. And for people who are in the know, this is a really easy way for them to converse with other people in the know and talk about very specific specimens without needing to relate an entire story. So first phase, you're going to see this is when weapons are associated with individuals. This is in the same time frame when swords are very scarce. Weapons are also rather scarce in the terms of unique tools. Excuse me. And what you end up seeing is either the name is going to be directly linked to the wielder, or the sword is literally going to be referred to the sword of somebody. In our last panel, there was a reference made to the sword of Attila. It's also occasionally referred to as the sword of Mars, and I've also heard it referred to once as the sword of God. But these weapons are amplifying authority. There's nothing intrinsic about them that is granting authority to their wielder. Perhaps the best and most recognizable example of this is going to be Thor's hammer Mjolnir. And you can see this in the name. If you trace the etymological of Thor back, you'll get a couple of different translations depending on where you go. But really the one that is most common and crops up is thunder. And I believe it's Proto-Germanic. And he wields his magical hammer called Mjolnir that is now extremely well known. And what ends up happening is if you take a look at Mjolnir, there's a couple of different translations, again, depending on where you go, but most of them are going to relate to Thor's sort of weather domains. I've seen Mjolnir translated as Thunderer, shining lightning weapon, references to snow. There is one that is a reference to like the grinder that doesn't really line up, but the other ones all do. So you immediately have this weapon that is literally at an elemental level tied to its owner. And then what is interesting is that story then goes a step farther and makes it so literally only Thor can wield it. The hammer is made as part of a series of bets about who the best blacksmiths are in the realm. And when it becomes clear that Loki is going to lose this bet, Loki is a trickster god, for those of you who don't know, he's going to lose this bet. He turns into a gadfly and bites the eye of the dwarf who is making Mjolnir, and it results in the shaft being slightly too short. Apologize, my bud keeps coming out there. And so another item is required for Thor to wield them. It's a magical pair of gauntlets that only he is in possession of. So now this is elementally linked to him and only he can wield it. And where the other sort of aspect of this is of this amplification of authority, you can see when Thor loses the hammer. There's a famous story where a frost giant named Thrym steals the hammer at the behest of Loki, to be completely clear. But what ends up happening at that point is Thor's authority is vastly diminished because he's not in possession of Mjolnir anymore. The rest of the gods then sort of go into a panic, and because without Mjolnir, they realize that they are kind of sitting ducks. And what they end up going to do is they go, okay, well, Thor, Thrym comes to them and says, I want a bride, and he wants Freya. And Freya says, absolutely not happening. And so they go, okay, well, we're going to dress Thor as a woman. We're going to sneak him in as a bride, and we will go and steal the hammer back, and we'll be okay. And what you end up seeing is Thor protests, and he goes, I'm afraid of my authority. He says, I'm afraid that the other Aesir will think I'm womanly. And that does get into some gender study stuff that I don't really have time to get into here, unfortunately. But there's this fear about the loss of his authority that's associated with the loss of his hammer, that is associated with him on this elemental level. Eventually, he is coerced by Loki into doing it, and they dress him up and they put him in a bridal gown. They get in and we have fun shenanigans. You know, the giant goes, "Why is my new wife eating 9 oxen and 6 fish and 6 barrels of meat and all this stuff?" But what ends up happening is then he orders Thrym orders the Mjolnir to be brought out and put on the lap as sort of a wedding gift. And the minute Thor gets that hammer back, he is then able to go back to killing frost giants, which is one of his critical sort of roles. And so you see the minute he has this authority re-magnified, he's able to go back to what he was doing, and he is restored in his power. Now, one of the really important things that I want to point out here is that you can tell this is a magnification instead of a granting of authority, is because Thor is never not the god of thunder, even when he doesn't have Mjolnir. And conversely, Thrym is not the god of thunder, even when he does have Mjolnir. There's another really good example of this. I'm going to do a little bit of a quick turn because I want to talk about the idea of this sort of a lost weapon, or the idea, again, this is an idea of the intrinsic authority. In Irish mythology, the Tuatha De Danann are this sort of mythical proto-settlers of Ireland, and they get into a war with the inhabitants called the Firbolgs. And the leader, Nuada, wields a sword called the Sword of Nuada. It's one of 4 treasures that is brought over from their mythical homeland. During the first battle of Mag Tuired, Nuada is actually grievously wounded. Depending on how you read it, he either loses his entire arm or just his hand, and it is replaced by a silver prosthetic made by the healing god Dion Kecht. Unfortunately for Nuada, when he's no longer whole, he's no longer physically perfect and complete, so he can no longer be king of the Tuatha De. So he actually hands his authority off to Lu Lamfada, who is another warrior god. But what you see is there's no transmission of the sword. The sword stays with Nuada, and Lu is actually mostly associated with a spear that is also one of the 4 treasures. Now, there are going to be other kings that do not have a high treasure, but you're looking at this sort of initial authority that is intrinsic in being magnified. And the way you can sort of think about this and simplify it is the person a king because they have the weapon, or are they a king and they have the weapon? And that's sort of the real key takeaway to this first phase of naming. People have the weapons and they are kings. It's not they have the weapons because they are kings. But where you're going to see that change is in this second phase. And in the second phase, the weapons are going to become a way to grant authority and conduit authority from an outside source. There are great examples in Christian Europe. They're going to explicitly invoke God or just divine authority in general. The last panel mentioned Joyeuse, the sword of Charlemagne. For those of you who do not know, Charlemagne, very important Frankish king, unites much of Western and Central Europe, and in 800 is crowned king of the Romans by Pope Leo III. I'm sorry, Emperor of the Romans, a title he held until his death in 1814. But what you see with the sword Joyeuse that Charlemagne wields is a distinct shift away from martial prowess. The sword is described as magical. It is supposed to change colors 30 times a day. It is made with all these gold and ornate jewels. And I've even seen a reference to the pommel supposedly having a piece of the lance of Longinus in the side of it, although that's much, much later. But what you are then seeing is this authority that Charlemagne is pulling on from Joy. And when he dies, the sword is actually continuously used in French coronation ceremonies from about 1250 to about 1850, 1820, I believe it ends with Charles X. And the sword is used as a coronation sword. It's one of the royal regalia. Perhaps most importantly, there's a very famous painting of Napoleon as an emperor, where he's seated on a throne and he has a sword tucked in kind of onto his side that's done after the style of Joyeuse. And Joyeuse itself was actually used in Napoleon's coronation ceremony. However, it's not the sword that Napoleon took to war. Napoleon took a saber to war. I believe it was actually sold about 20 years ago for about $6 million. But those are 2 distinct things. Here's my war sword, and then here's the sword that I have that grants me my authority as well. In that case, he was the emperor of the French. But that's this difference. It's not just about martial prowess and Napoleon being in charge anymore. Now it's about this idea of trying to draw out authority and having this mediation, which is a very Catholic idea, which leads into the next one. At the siege of Acre, which is the first major counterattack against Saladin by Guy of Jerusalem between 1189 and 1191, there's actually a number of named trebuchets there. There's one called Daughter of the Earthquake, there's Warwolf, but importantly, there's one called God's Stone Thrower. And what you end up seeing is that people are starting to figure out that if you have this weapon or item that is a conduit to an outside authority, it's a mediation between you, me, and God, you can convince people of not only the righteousness of your cause, you can start to see how it will, you can justify other actions as well. they actually park a priest next to this trebuchet, and what they end up doing is the priest will preach and ask for donations and hire people to get stones large enough for the trebuchet to throw, and it proves to be extremely lethal. But he's doing it in the name of God, and he's sort of playing this conduit game. I'm not asking for it, but I have God's stone throwers, so God is on my side, and I'd like you to go get me a large rock. And that's this key takeaway in phase 2. Weapons are a conduit. They're going to be used to transfer authority. You're going to use them to take authority from other sources. You're no longer relying on the intrinsic authority of yourself, as the previous iteration did. And then finally, and sort of perhaps one of the most interesting is this sort of the third phase, where the collecting community and the museum community have developed a verbal shorthand, either organically or inorganically, to let sort of other either professionals or people in the know about specific items, and that they are able to sort of identify specific things and specific qualities about these things that are shorthand for their rarity, their desirability, or something of that nature. When you see this applied organically, it tends to come out of a collector or a museum. And a really good example of this is a 1847 Colt Walker, serial number 1078, referred to as the thumbprint Walker. The thumbprint Walker is a very important American weapon. Only about 1,100 were made. I think 125 or 150 are known. And there's a particular Walker that was found in Mexico, I believe in the 40s. Very high condition, which is a big deal for collectors and museums. And what they found is this on the frame, there's a small thumbprint, like a thumbprint. During the finishing process, when the metal is heated, and then the metal is sort of has a protective layer of rust put on it, not to get too deep into the metallurgical terms, it was picked up too soon before it had cooled completely. And so the collector fraternity has latched onto that gun completely. It's well regarded, it's a good condition gun. And what you see, excuse me one second. Excuse me. It's good condition. And what you see is that this sort of mythology springs up around the gun. There are all these ideas about whose thumbprint it is. Was it the engineer that day? Was it Sam Colt himself? And so they have collectively started to call it the thumbprint Walker, and it's very well regarded in the collecting community. In the last several years, the gun has actually been sold twice, I believe both times for $530,000 one time and $600,000 another. But what you'll also see is an inorganic application. Or excuse me, let me back up. But the sort of the key takeaway there is this authority is no longer present. It's not any point, there's no longer an issue of authority being granted either to the owner of the Colt Walker or the person who made it. Sam Colt is long dead, and just owning the thumbprint Walker does not make you a foremost authority amongst Colt collectors. Now, sort of on the other side, we're starting to see this, especially in the 80s, commercially. For those, Holland & Holland, a very high-end boutique shotgun company based in London, actually, they hold 2 royal warrants, decided that they were going to try and revive a 4-bore rifle, 4-bore double gun, excuse me. And for those of you who do not know, sort of the lower the number is, the bigger the bore. And traditionally, 4 bores are used for commercial hunting, goose guns, things like that. But they were outlawed because you could take a whole bunch of game at once, and it was too effective. It was damaging the ecosystems. So in 1985, Holland & Holland, as part of their products of excellence, decided we're going to build a 4-bore kind of to show the craft of the company and what they can do. And I can't prove this, but I imagine that there were probably a bunch of marketing people going, what could we use a 4-bore for these days? And someone, kind of jokingly, offhandedly said, oh, you can use it to hunt a dinosaur. And someone took that very seriously. And so they started on what would come to be known as the saurian. They enlisted Paul and Alan Brown, the Brown brothers, two world incredible engravers, and they actually engraved the gun with a bunch of dinosaurs. They then took that gun in best config. They took that gun and then put it in a lizard skin wrapped case, and they took that and they filled it with all sorts of fossils, lizard skin knives. There's, I believe, 100 rounds were specially loaded for it by Kynoch, which is a boutique ammo manufacturer, and had those wrapped in lizard skin, and put all these things together as sort of a complete package, and then put that out and called it the saurian, Dinosaurian. And that was sort of a marketing ploy. This is that inorganic application of what you are trying to, apply to the gun. What you're trying to see as a sort of in the know person. What makes the gun special? It's the saurian. It's related to dinosaurs. It has all these special accoutrements with it. But again, you're seeing authority not being really relevant to the gun. It's a shorthand. It's a collector thing. There's no special association of owning the saurian. I actually don't know where that gun is. I don't know if anybody does other than the owner. And owning it doesn't make you a leading authority on Holland and Holland or English or even English best guns. But that's sort of the three real basic phases that you'll see. And I just kind of to recap and hit them back up again. In the first phase, it's a heavy focus on the intrinsic nature of the wielder. This is when swords are rare. This is when arms that are specifically designed as arms and do nothing else are rather rare. And the weapon is going to magnify the authority of the wielder. I am Thor, I am the god of thunder, and I wield Mjolnir. In the second phase, weapons are going to function more as a conduit for outside authority. They're mediators. Weapons are becoming more common, as was said in the last panel. Guys have bags of swords, and so you need a way in order to identify important people without just being, oh, he's the only guy in the town that has the sword, and it's supernatural in nature, and all these stories crop up around it. So they start to function as conduits for authority. And then finally, in this third phase, which we're still seeing today, you'll see the authority stripped completely out of the item, and at that point, you're not even going to have an authority associated with it. There is no special authority associated with owning the Colt Walker or owning the Saurian gun, and it doesn't make you a specialist on anything. This has been a real brief sort of overview. There are a bunch of other cultures that do this as well. I know that this is widely focused on Western Europe, but there are great examples of this stuff all over the world. Japan has the Kusanagi blade, which is part of their imperial regalia and was used as early or as recently as 2019, I believe, during the ascension of Naruhito to the emperorship. And you'll see even other parts of the world. One of Muhammad's sons wields a sword called Zulfikar. It's got a dual point. So if you're interested in it, I would take a look out. Look at where you are and see what these named weapons are and see when they're made, and take a look at the authority and what they grant, and you'll be very surprised, I think, at what you find. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to hand this back to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much, Eric. It was absolutely fascinating paper. We'll do questions afterwards. We've had a few coming through the chat already, so please do keep the questions coming. But yeah, for the time being, let's move on to the second of our papers, which is in fact a dual-headed affair, featuring two very prestigious scholars of the medieval period, Dr. Kelly DeVries and Dr. Michael Livingston. Their paper, which is accompanied by a translation, which hopefully you've had through already, will explore the manufacture and use of medieval arms through poetic means. So Kelly, Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much. Just get things set here. All right. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So today, Eustache Deschamp, who was born in 1344, died 1404, is perhaps best known among English speakers for having been one of the first writers to attest to the international reputation of Geoffrey Chaucer. The English writer was strongly influenced by the poetry of both Deschamps and Deschamp's uncle, Guillaume de Michaud, as well as other French writers like Guillaume de Lorry and Jean de Meun, the authors of the massively popular Roman de la Rose. And sometime in the late 14th century, Deschamps wrote a ballade that honored Chaucer as a great translator, as he says. So he wrote well over 1,000 other ballads, as well as an influential treatise on French poetry and a over 12,000 line satirical poem about women. Deschamps was, like Chaucer himself, perhaps most known in his lifetime as a diplomat, and employee of the royal government. Growing up during the first stages of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Crécy happened when he was 2, Poitiers when he was 12. Deschamps had plenty of reasons to be interested in arms, armor, and the conduct of warfare. We assume, though, that his administrative position for the crown played a particularly large role in keeping military matters at the forefront of his mind. In 1372, Charles V named him Huissier d'Armes, a weapons officer for the King's Guard. It is certainly the case that Deschamps frequently called upon the language of war in his poetry to talk about the tribulations of love, the turbulence of stormy weather, which we just heard a bit about with Thor, and much else. But away from metaphor, Deschamps occasionally references specific real-world conflicts in his day. So he complains about the constant revolts of the Flemings, for instance. And when he received news of the French disaster at Nicopolis, he wrote a poem honoring the dead. A later poem actually similarly kind of praised those who'd gone on the ill-fated crusade period, whether or not they died at Nicopolis or not. Given the geopolitical circumstances of his age, it should hardly be surprising that the English are frequent targets of his poetic ire. Though he appreciated individual Englishmen, like Chaucer, he was hardly appreciative of the English as a whole. The English possession of Calais led him to write a pastorelle with the refrain, "There can be no peace if they do not release Calais." He frequently encourages his king to take arms against the English. In many regards, this particular fight was personal for him. He was living with Michaud in Rouen when it was besieged by the English in 1359, an occasion actually on which a young Geoffrey Chaucer was captured by the French, as it happens, though we have no evidence that the poets, any of these three poets, met at that time with Chaucer. And in his work, Miroir de Mirage, he refers to the horrific devastation that the besiegers at that time wrought upon the countryside. Now, at the same time, Deschamps was hardly a blind partisan. He was more than willing to acknowledge how suffering could be passed on to the people of France by their own rulers as well. For example, the poet takes this fairly anti-establishment position, we could call it, in a striking ballade that was written from the viewpoint of peasants suffering under the war practices of the noble class. So despite all this, Deschamps is not a terribly well-known poet of his age. He's generally ignored, especially in English-speaking communities, beyond his connection to Chaucer. And he seems largely unknown within the arms and armor community. So, here we are. During his time as Huissier d'Armes, in 1374 or 1375, still trying to nail that down, Deschamps wrote the particular poem that we're going to be discussing today, in which he curses those who would require him to make arms. Whether his position at the time is pertinent to the composition of the poem, or who indeed it is that he blames for the requirement to make arms, whether French, English, or otherwise, is not clear from the text. What is clear, however, is that Deschamps' poem, while brief, reveals a fascinating awareness of the manufacture and usage of medieval arms. So I'm going to present it here in English, though we have the original French for you on the screen. We have the English on the screen because we don't know how many people got it at home. So I know a lot of people are watching on YouTube. So this is a curse on those who would require arms to be made. From evil daggers from Bordeaux and swords from Clermont, crossbow bolts and knives made from Milanese steel, to small axes beaten to strength by hammers, croque-pois, iron lance heads, short spears, long swords, guisarmes. He can keep his money, whoever would require me to make arms. From cannons, using both stones and quarrels, espringals, Greek fire, engines, catapults, wall breakers, which when discharged will let projectiles fly, to perilous bows that pierce so deep and are so suddenly loosed at so great a distance, and always land with sorrow and tears, in grief, in despair, who would require me to make arms? From maces, from Damascus, flails, pikes that the Flemings use, heavy crossbows that are so fast, lead hammers that disfigure bodies, spikes, spears that are called javelins, to sharp glaives without hope of healing. Thus would it kill or wound those, or you, who are with those arms. They cause damage to honor and courage. Who would require me to make arms? And then an envoy. Princes with anvils and hammers of copper, bronze, wood, iron enchantments or charms. Let it reach through to your entrails and gut you like pigs, those who would require me to make arms. So this is just delightful. This isn't actually the only time that Deschamps writes of weapons. He scolds the hammers of lead in the Maillotins revolt in 1382, for instance, though this is a description of the rioters as much as it is of the simple weapons with which they resisted. In another poem, he draws comparisons between specific weapons and deities. Nowhere else, though, does he get into the specifics of the arms of war in this same sort of way, because as Kelly's about to talk about, these are really specific.
Thank you, Mike. And yes, I discovered this poem quite by chance in graduate school. So I've been working on it for a couple of years. And I thought initially it was going to be quite easy to recognize some of the terms that were used. I have read a lot of late 14th century documents. I also am aware of how nomenclature, how the names of weapons can change within only a very few years. But I thought for sure there's not going to be much of a problem. And in fact, I only found one term within the poem in French. Maces is maces. And there is no other, and no question that I have about that. You can see the Royal Armouries mace there that's dated roughly for 200 years. More close to the time is this wonderful little statue that I found in Lisbon and Coimbra of Sir Domingos de Goanes, and it's from this period. And you could see very clearly the mace that he carries on this. Now, I actually meant to say this at the very beginning, I apologize, but there is no defensive weaponry or armor mentioned in this at all, in this poem. It's only offensive weapons. It's very clear that Deschamps only wants to look at weapons that do the wounding and killing, not any armor that might be protecting the soldier. And so you can see very clearly that this man is outfitted completely in armor, but he has his mace jauntily held over his head. Beyond that, there were a couple of others. This is kind of an easily recognizable weapon, and that is, I'm not massacre the French, hache, which is clearly an axe. We've translated it as a small axe, and there is a reason for that. By the way, it seems to be the preferred weapon of rabbits in the late 14th century. I don't have any idea why. And there, you can see that they're both using this with two hands, although I'm not sure that we can determine that at all. And there are no extant axe heads that can be certifiably dated to the late 14th century. So I don't have any examples of that, but there are plenty of these type of drawings. Not so many of the men used them. The other one that's a little bit, of course, it's easy, the espes or épées. I'm leaving out the country designations for the moment. Mike will get to that at the end. But here we have espes, swords. The only reason I say that they're similar weapons is that there are two references to swords in this poem. The other is an espafouche. I'm going to cease trying to translate that. And that one was a little bit more difficult. I mean, the swords are fairly obvious. There's a 14th century, two 14th century swords on the screen. There are others that date pretty certainly to the 14th century. Victor Gay, who's amazing dictionnaire archaeologique, is widely used. And in fact, he is only one of two authors that is referred to this poem, and he sometimes uses it directly on his definitions of the certain weapons. There's one other I'll get to in just a moment. He doesn't actually mention espahas in any of his variations, but Merrick in 1842 in his critical inquiry into ancient armor referred to it as a kind of broadsword. So I went with there. The two references that Merrick has to 1370 and 1384 are vague, but one in 1384 actually says that John de Lorme was armed in a habersham and equipped with an espafouche. So I think this is pretty certain that knife, if you only have one weapon mentioned, it's going to be his knife or his sword. Sorry. What these might be, I don't know. Because these seem to be a little bit bigger in at least Merrick's definition. I looked at Oakeshot's type 16 to 18. You can see the variations on the one side. The only thing and there are several swords that might fall into that category, some that more in catalogs of newly made swords rather than medieval exemplars. I do find these that were captured by the Ottomans from European knights. Although they date them to the 14th, 15th century, I don't think we'd be certain about them. It's clearly a crusader sword in the middle that's awfully big and would fall into the category of Oakeshott 18. So maybe this is what is being referred to as an espafouche. Daggers, again, there was one reference, the dag from Bordeaux, but there's also another reference, Cousteau, which is clearly a dagger as well. I love using that image from the Morgan Picture Bible. Somebody had fun when they were illuminating that. And then you can see this wonderful triptych I found in Duomo Museum in Florence that shows a very interesting knife being held, as well as a couple of quivers with arrows. But there's an array of them. These are, for example, are on display in the National Museum of Denmark. As far as the Cousteau is concerned, Gay refers to this as a long knife or dagger or sharp edge or pointed pole arm. But the references that he has to this period, Boissart in 1368, it's very clearly a dagger that's put into a sheath. And in 1375, a reference to an armory refers to it as a misericordi, a similar name, or either a Cousteau or a misericordi. So I think that's pretty easy to rationalize there. There are others. The lances and spears get several references. You can see there's 4 iron lance heads. The archegay, which I get to in a moment, short spear, a broche, which we even translated. We've even changed that. That'll be different on your translation if you have it, because I've decided a little bit. Mike and I decided there was a spike. And then the spears that are called javelins. You can see the spears are everywhere. It's still in the end 14th century or 14th century, like the Sienese allegory of good government and the stained glass window, which has the Tewkesbury Knights on it. I enjoyed these differences of St. George the Dragon around the same time. So those are clearly lances. Beyond, I mean, javelins, we don't actually get a lot of illumination of those. The spearheads on the one side might be from javelins. Those are my own personal ones, and but the only really shown thrown javelin that can be seen as spears are in the Bayeux Tapestry, which is many years before, of course. The Archigae is an interesting one because the other article that refers to this refers to the poem David Scott McNabb's Medieval Folk Etymology, Etymologizing and Modern Misconstruals of Old French. Miss Archigae actually concludes that Gay is right, that this is a short spear, and so forth. The reference to Flemish pikes is quite an interesting one, and that comes, you could actually see what the Flemish pikes look like, because we have this illustration of the Ghent militia from around 1370 to 80 that unfortunately is destroyed now. It's destroyed in World War I. But what is curious is that the goeiedag, which is the more common Flemish weapon, is not mentioned at all in this poem. Now, elsewhere, it is mentioned in one of the other poems, but the Deschamps wrote, but this is not mentioned here, so that's always a curiosity. This is the staff weapons. We kept the translation because these are very difficult to translate. All of those are names that are in Gay, but it's very clear he doesn't actually know what they are. He mentions their staff weapons all the way down. The flail is a little more easy to see, and there's always a discussion about, well, flails were never used, except you find them in all sorts of illustrations. You see the two that I have on the screen, but some have suggested that maybe the flails are these kind of odd things that I learned at Dungeons and Dragons 100 years ago that were morning stars, which is not a term that is used until the 16th century. But these are also very common. So what is mentioned, what is meant by Deschamps is unknown. The Fauchard is very different. This is, you can see the Larousse's encyclopedia has one. The Royal Armouries has a 16th century Italian. Neither of these, by the way, are mentioned by Trosso or Waldman being the Fauchard. Both of them suggest that that it doesn't have a hook on. The Guisarme is similarly oddly titled. Why the Metropolitan Museum of Art calls this a Guisarme, because Trosso says definitely a Roncone. And Locking has got some really fantastic things here, because he's taken one of the Royal Armouries weapons and decided this is where it goes. It's a Guisarme, and we have no clue. A little bit more security on his definitions of a Dodane, crossbow bolts. Host piece is a heavy crossbow. Both these are referred to a lot in text, so they're not difficult. The Dodane I've translated previously. There's 5,000 or 2,500 of them that are sent to James II as a weapons dowry by Philip the Good of Burgundy. The perilous art is very different, because I've never seen it referred to as this. And what it is a bow. I have no idea, but I think it's probably, it may be referring to the longbow, which the French would still have regarded as pretty perilous at this period of time. But there is more clarity there. It's clearly not a crossbow, because those terms would have been used differently. By the way, here's just a couple of illustrations of crossbow bolts, probably Dodane in the Walters. A horn crossbow. These are very difficult to date. Is this what Deschamps means by the host piece? I don't know. It does still have the foot rest, which would be indicated by the pied on the end of this. Whether we're also transitioning to the steel crossbows, which usually dated a couple of decades later, as you can see, one illustration is probably also a possibility. There's several non-gunpowder artillery. I find this kind of interesting, because these are all translated differently throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages. Randall Rogers' Latin siege warfare in the 12th century has a whole list of these at the end. And so too does Michael Fulton's very good books on the siege weapons of the Crusades that have just come out in the last few years. But we're also looking at the very end date of the use of these type of non-gunpowder artillery pieces. And you know, the Espadrille, maybe a ballista. You can see Walter Millet manuscript about 1326. I found this very interesting one in Top Capitalis. They date it to the end of the Middle Ages, but they haven't gotten anything more on it. But I find that very interesting because it's never been written up or discussed. What the other catapults were, I don't know. This guy's Bellefortis has several dated about 1410. We seen them on battlefield and sieges around 1420. So Bellefortis may be looking back at these, and you can see again the different ones that he puts in his work. Finally, the really interesting weapons for me, because I've written a lot on early cannons, is this reference to cannons that are both used stones or balls and quarrels, because I was told very frankly that by Claude Blair, when he was still alive, that they never fired bolts. The Millet manuscript and the pseudo-Aristotle gun are complete fabrications as far as that's concerned. Claude was a great scholar, but he could be very nasty in his criticism. And in fact, I didn't get a chance to point out that these are all over the place. Boissard mentions them several times. The bolt firing artillery, gunpowder artillery, but also we have balls being fired from the very beginning of the 14th century. This is a period of real transition in gunpowder weaponry, though. The walls of Ordroic are pierced, earth and wood fortification. They're pierced by gunshot in 1379. Boissard says it's actually quarrels. Favershausfeld is the first battle that is decided by gunfire in 1382. Removable chambers come into being, and the first handgun is mentioned by Richard II, or during Richard II's reign in around 1380. And you know what these may look like. Unfortunately, we don't have any extant guns dated to this period, and the illustrations we have are very undated as well. The one from the Bodleian Library, it comes on the basis of Nick Norman's views, and I'm not entirely certain that it's agreed to by everybody, but it does show an interesting gun being used there. There's only one thing and I'm going to end on this. The plomb is very interesting because we've translated lead hammers. That's because it is used by Deschamps elsewhere, although in the other, it's always plomb de marteau. Here you can see it. Unfortunately, there are no lead hammers that still exist. They're all made of steel, as the Royal Armouries in the 15th century, or the clear one by Paolo Uccello in the 15th century. I thought maybe these could be the lead mallets that are referred to in Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt, but they're used as weapons after the archers pound the stakes in with them as well. And you can see some of these in illustrations. This, for example, 1400 tapestry of Jordan de Bayeux. But as Mike mentioned, the revolt of Maletins is very clearly, because the Maletins are called Maletins because they use this type of weapon. And so if Deschamps is meaning that's what, I have a little bit of difficulty meaning that. And in fact, I throw this open to anybody who might have some information on that. And I'll turn it back to Mike.
Thank you, Kelly. So there are several observations to make in light of all of this. First, the array of staff weapons listed by Deschamps calls attention to itself for us. From the point of view of translation, as we've heard, the wild variance of these weapons with different names in every language for each, it seems, makes any attempt to express them in modern English terms fairly impossible. It's for this reason that we've opted to remain on those original forms. Beyond this, it's a stark reminder that the proximity of warfare was so close for the common public in late 14th century France that a courtier poet, even one assigned to the position of huissier d'armes for the king, clearly had at hand the vocabulary of this diverse catalog of weaponry. Second, the arrangement of the weapons is really interesting. So the envoy clearly brings together the components of weapons crafting. Are the other stanzas meant to fit together? We might categorize the first stanza, for instance, as anti-personnel weapons, and the second stanza as anti-fortification weapons, for instance. This mostly fits what we're given, like the actual details of what these things are, except that the arrows appear with the weapons to combat fortifications, if that's the case, while the crossbow bolts appear with the weapons to combat personnel. Is it possible that Deschamps considered arrows more suitable as area attack weapons than crossbow bolts, perhaps due to their range and arc trajectories? Or was it a question of their greater rates of shot, which allowed for greater coverage against masked men rather than individual? This could potentially affect how we think about the tactical usage of these weapons in combat at the time. And what to make of stanza 3? Are those weapons held together by the particularly horrible nature of the wounds they make? That's certainly the context that Deschamps gives for them. But the weapons in the other stanzas can do a lot of horrible damage too. So why is he isolating these? Now, it may be, of course, that these orders, these gatherings, are not significant beyond the dictates of poetic constraint or even the poet's personal call to memory. But the gatherings nevertheless invite speculation. Third, we want to draw attention to Deschamps' connection between different weapons and different locations of manufacture. So Bordeaux daggers, Clermont swords, Milanese knives, and Damascene maces. Some of these locations were, by this point, being connected to the quality of their steel, for instance, but we haven't been able to find a clear attachment between these places and these specific tools of war. Damascus steel was a known entity, in other words, but nothing about Damascus that we can find is connected to mace usage or manufacture exclusively. We don't know of strictly regional association in medieval weapons making of these kinds. That we know of, that is. So, it's possible that we are seeing here in this poem the results of the poet's need to fit metrical constraints. That's certainly a possibility, as with the stanza organization. But it's also possible that we're seeing the evidence that for Deschamps and for his contemporaries, there was an association for which we have no other access. So just as he knew the difference between pole arms that may kind of elude us today, he knew a connection between Damascus and maces, Bordeaux and daggers, Clermont and swords. And obviously, if any of you in the audience have a clue what that connection is, we would really love to hear it. We would welcome that. Kelly?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of end this up with a real suggestion of how eye-opening this has been to both Mike and I. We study this period extensively, and yet I was just mentioning to him before we went on that overall, I think I can say that almost all 100 Years' War books are completely wrong about arms and armor being used at the end of the 14th century, at least according to Deschamps. Now, part of that is because the French have done a lot of arms and armor research in the end of the 14th century, and the English just don't care about much after the death of Black Princes before Henry V comes aboard. But really the interesting roles that some of these weapons play, and the fact that Deschamps highlights them clearly means that we have to look again at both the original sources and other, primarily illustrations that are dated to this period, perhaps even extant weapons, although they're very difficult to date. So, I'm throwing this out to anybody in the audience. If you've got any idea about what we've got wrong here, or maybe just a couple of slaps on the back of what we got right, I don't think maces is in dispute. We would really appreciate it. And thank you very much for your attention today.
Fantastic. So not only do we have a virtual conference, but we've got crowdsourced history. So if anyone can chip anything on that poem, then thank you very much. But yes, thank you to all three of our speakers. Absolutely fantastic. I've got quite a few questions of my own, but actually Clement Bernard has provided quite a neat one to link them together, which is, what do you think of the use of weapons pictured in a lot of recent shows or movies? So Kelly and Michael, I guess if we're going to have to overthrow, existing understandings of what arms and armour are used, I presume that there aren't any fictional depictions that even come close to the scale of what we would see just based on this poem.
Not the breadth of the weapons, certainly. I was recently on a YouTube show on the accuracy between movies and arms and armor, and it was a lot of fun to do. Condé Nast, strangely, wanted it done. And there are a couple, especially the Maximilian show that's on the 15th century, is really good as far as the arms and armor are concerned. And then you've got Braveheart. So beyond, somewhere in between those is an accurate depiction, but nothing to the breadth we've got here. Mike might know the literary source a little bit better.
Fantastic. And to Eric, so an interesting question from Clement was whether, specifically Thor, whether Marvel's depicting Thor accurately when he wields Mjolnir in the context of this authority and his struggle with having the weapon, sometimes not having the weapon, that sort of stuff.
No, is the short, clean answer. Marvel has really sort of taken Thor and whitewashed him a little bit. At the time when Lee was writing Thor, he still had the winged helmet. I mean, and as we know now, that's a Wagnerian sort of invention. That wasn't something the Vikings ever actually wore. In Thor's not typically depicted as blonde. He's normally got red hair and this huge beard. So he's been cleaned up significantly for Marvel, and his actions have as well. But when you look at the sort of this phase and idea, they've taken Mjolnir out of the first phase and put it into the second one. Because in the first phase, when you're looking at this sort of intrinsic authority of Thor, Thor's the only one who can wield it. But in the comics and the movies, you're looking at the idea of there's a particular word they use, but this idea of the righteous can wield it, and that's why Spider-Man can and Captain America can, and that is very distinctly into the second phase, where you're able to share authority, and they're using this conduit as an outside source. I can wield Mjolnir because I am righteous. So it's not accurate, but it sure is fun.
True. Although I guess I'm thinking about King Arthur specifically, in that presumably someone who was a Dark Ages figure, if he ever had an Excalibur, was updated for the medieval era when the chroniclers.
Yeah.
In fact, that leads us, I didn't intend that, but we had a question from Anna, who I know is watching from New Zealand, and thank you very much for being up at this time if it's late there. But she asks, firstly, what is the focal point in respect of functions and phases? So talking about Joyeux, the sword of Charlemagne, is it Charlemagne who believes that the sword is bestowed with power, or his subjects, or a narrator, or is this a modern interpretation?
For Joyeuse, I would argue that the authority is going to be, or the focal point is going to be in the people. Just because authority, if Charlemagne is the only one who believes that the authority is present in the sword, it just makes Charlemagne a little better than the guy on the street that yells, "I've got a magic stick." So someone else has to believe it, and in this case, his subjects have to believe it. Whether or not it's a contemporary iteration or not, I believe it's a little bit more contemporary or a little bit more later, especially because Charlemagne dies in 814, but you're not seeing the sword really being used as a coronation piece for a few hundred years. So that's a later sort of interpretation and use of the sword.
And the second question that she had were, are these phases chronologically arranged? So coming back to Excalibur, is the mythical sword of the Lady of the Lake an earlier version as opposed to the second stage, Excalibur being a later myth?
So, oops, pull that right back so I don't lose it. So the phases are sort of chronologically arranged. I sort of think of them more as what society wants out of their leaders rather than what time period it is, because you can see these swords being used in a different context. And I saw the other question on YouTube, and I'll explain. The swords can move around in phases and transition between them and exist in more than one at once. But if we look at the sword of Excalibur, that is sort of where you're seeing the it's both first and second stage, and it's part of this transitional period, because you're looking at not only is the sword this sort of rightful, Britain, the King of England can wield Excalibur. You're also looking at powerful martial enchantments on it that magnify the authority of Arthur. The ability to not be killed until the scabbard is lost and he dies. But you're sort of seeing this sort of transitional phase where he's drawing an outside authority, but it's existing in both the first and second stage at the same time, if that makes sense.
Do you want to specifically address Rob Jones's question from YouTube?
Absolutely. So there's really some interesting things that happen during this transitional period, and when something can go through multiple phases. I think probably the best example of this is the Kusanagi blade out of Japan. It's sort of this mythical katana that's given to a Shinto priest. And at first, it's actually referred to as a different name, and unfortunately, I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But it's the heaven splitting sword, and it's given to this Shinto priest who keeps it, and when he uses it in a especially heroic act to kill a warlord by cutting some grass and depriving him of the ability to use fire to kill him, it's renamed the Kusanagi sword, and there is an epithet on the end of that. And again, I'm not well versed in Japanese. But they renamed it the grass cutting sword. So you have again this intrinsic authority of the Shinto priest wielding it. I have the Kusanagi blade, this martial prowess that's magnifying my authority. And then the sword disappears from the record until about 660, I believe, when it shows back up. And it's used as part of the imperial regalia of Japan. And now you have this second phase qualities associated with it, where it is part of the imperial regalia. I have the Kusanagi blade. It's supposed to be this powerful magical artifact, and I am using it to grant myself authority. However, you start to see it disappears kind of from the public eye, which is also one of these sort of things that we talked about in the second phase. No longer is the sword used martially, and in fact, there are stories that a bunch of the Shinto priests who were taking care of it had it and opened up the box, and like 3 of them died, and the 4th was like critically injured, and it was poisoned and diseased. And when the sword was used in Naruhito's ascension in 2019, the sword was actually kept in its box. Mm-hmm. So you can see this sort of transitional and where things can move. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they can exist in more than one phase, and they can exist in multiple phases at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, the reason that I like the combination of these two papers is because in theory you have, on the one hand, swords giving authority, and well, swords and weapons, and on the other, you've got Deschamps, who is seemingly his authority is being impugned by having to make these weapons. But it's quite a tricky, it's a very personal poem, but it's quite a tricky one to interpret. So for Kelly and Michael, I was wondering, what do you think fundamentally his objection through the poem? Is it having to make these weapons? Is it being involved in manufacture rather than use? Or is this all sort of tongue-in-cheek and actually he's not that unhappy with his position? It's just a nice poem.
So this is a terrific question. And it honestly, it's hard to say. Trying to spot satire from outside of the satirical context in which something is written is tremendously difficult. We don't know the exact year that this is written. As I said, it's 74, 75. Where was he giving this? The surviving manuscript context doesn't have a smiley face next to it. That would be nice. Winky face, emoticon. You don't want to have that kind of stuff. So there's no satire font. There's no irony. So how do we kind of draw that out? when you look at it in the context of these other poems where it's really hard to read it as satirical when he's saying, how horrible it is that the peasants are being treated the way they're being treated in some of these, the warfare is taking these innocents and murdering them. When he's talking about what he saw with his own eyes at Rouen and the destruction wrought by the besieging English, when he's going into these things, it's really hard to read that as satirical. Like if that's satirical, like he's a sociopath, like that leads us into some really interesting, weird stuff. So given that he seems very serious in these other contexts, it would fit that he's serious here. Now, what does that mean sort of, on the ground? Who's he talking to, right? I mean, in one sense, who's making him do this is the king. Like, I mean, that's, on a kind of literal level. So is he cursing the king? Probably not. I mean, I think he's probably more aiming this at, the sort of geopolitical contexts that are forcing this to happen. So we can't know. But for my own part, I would actually kind of see this as more or less, anti-English, these revolting Flemings, however you want to think of revolting there, from his standpoint, that that these circumstances, people not doing what they're supposed to be doing, people forcing me to have to do this, it's like, make me stop hitting you, it's this kind of positioning of authority there. We can't take satire off the table, but I think it makes more sense, given the whole context of Deschamps, his output and his circumstance, not to think of it as satirical. Do you have anything to add there, Kelly?
Yeah, I think the age of this poem, this is a real interesting time, because the Black Prince is dying or almost dead. Edward III is almost gone. English have lost tons in France. So there's a time that's forced peace. Charles V is going to die in 1380. So it's a French upheaval. The Flemings are constantly in revolt during the 14th century. This is the beginning, though, of the Ghent revolt, which is going to be very costly to France. And so and we've got to remember, too, there's a rise of pacifism at this period of time. Wycliffe starts preaching, get us out of warfare at this time, and he's allowed to do this. In fact, he's, John of Gaunt and the Black Prince before, but John of Gaunt is very much a supporter of Wycliffe, even though he's saying, exactly what John of Gaunt is not doing in Portugal and in Spain at this period of time. So there's I don't think the satire is here. I really do think that he is angry at the destruction, although this is directed at the English and the Flemings. Why are you making us do this? Leave France alone. You can almost read that. Leave France alone. Leave us alone.
Yeah, I have to say, I've only just realised, of course, that those who would require arms to be made has a twin meaning, because instantly I thought it and saw it and thought, well, that's your superiors who are asking you. But of course, the people who require it are the people who need punishing, need disciplining. So yeah, I did have another question on that front. I guess one thing to add to that would be, in terms of French court structure, how advantageous is this position to Deschamps? Is it purely an office of profit and it'll make him some money but not much glory, or does it potentially bring him into contact with influential people? Is that any use to him at this stage?
Mike may have a little bit better idea, because he knows the poetic relationship to diplomacy at this point, especially with Chaucer as well. Michaud is playing a role in diplomacy too. It's kind of interesting that kings seem to want to have bright guys around them that can wrap this all up in poetry. We saw that back in our book on Crecy as well. But I think that the issue is really that Deschamps doesn't need it. He doesn't need to be Huissier d'Armes.
Mhm.
He's pretty prolific. He's patronized for other reasons. And I mean, how many thousand poems, Mike, does he write?
It's over 1,000 ballades alone, not to mention the pastorals and all this other stuff. Yeah, he's really prolific. And yeah, as Kelly was saying, he's doing okay on his own, and it's he's the nephew of Michaud. He's doing all right. Being Huissier d'Armes, I mean, he's with the King's Guard. I mean, it is a prestigiousness just in the sense of being within the court, right? And that is a proximity to power that is unmistakable. People want to be in those positions. There would be a monetary compensation as well. So he's definitely getting that. He's got connections to these avenues that can get him patronage, that can get him connections. So there's a lot that's positive there for him to be in this position. It is a nice position to have, right? To be the Huissier d'Armes as opposed to being, the schmuck standing at the door, right? There's a distinct class difference between those. One is, of the officer class. One is sort of in charge of, having the material there for everybody to do their jobs. And it does separate him from, it is a more of an administrative position as opposed to a, get out there and start swinging your sword, poet boy. That's not what's happening for him. He's in there right in the bills and that sort of stuff. And Kelly's absolutely right as well that that in this period in the 14th century especially, I mean, it may extend beyond that, but we really see it sharply here. There is this distinct effort by the kings of England and France to have, here's my clever poet, who can stand alongside me and make this all sound really spiffy, or that I can send, as Chaucer was sent, to be a diplomat, as Michaud has to be sent to be a diplomat. These are well-spoken people. They are, engaged in culture. It sort of shows off all that nice stuff. And to some degree, this hasn't really been studied much, but to some degree, the fact that Deschamps talks about Chaucer as this great translator, Chaucerian scholars make a big deal about that as, look, he has this international reputation. Probably not. Probably what it's showing is that within these circles of poet/diplomats, they have kind of a little community, and they're in contact with each other. And that's part of why they are also then sent as diplomats and to have this kind of association, because they can, it's sort of like the back room. Oh, let the poets figure it out over there, and they'll kind of come back to us, and tell us what might work, and make it sound nice on the way. So there's that kind of stuff that's happening in the background of all this. It isn't really well studied, in part probably because there's just not a lot we can go from, right? Those kind of it's not, I don't want to say it's like a spy network, right? But it's something that's intentionally not out in the foreground. And so it's not talked about much. We can only glean it from these connections that we see between these people. The fact that Chaucer is using Deschamps' poetry, in some of his own, he rips off some lines, because Chaucer rips off from everybody, because that's what you did at the time. So there is this kind of stuff happening. He was well connected in those regards. Is that, again, kind of the background of this poem? It is, to what effect, we don't know.
Just want to mention two names that must be linked in this. Froissart is still alive. He's writing. He's back in France. He's well known. And Christine de Pizan is just coming in. So we're going after 1410, when she's and then 1420, she's pretty well out of it. They've turned to churchmen again. And not because all these other people we've talked about are secular.
Yeah, and I suppose just to add to that, perhaps one of the reasons he's so upset that people still require arms to be made is because it's delaying the ascendancy of this more educated, well-spoken, not necessarily strategically informed, but it's delaying the ascent of of people from him to closer positions. So just to turn back to Eric quickly, we got a question from Stephen Gunn, who asks, can these arguments about naming swords, hammers and small arms also be applied to larger weapons in later centuries, like 15th and 16th century cannon or 20th century aircraft? Which is something I thought, actually, because thinking of naming weapons, the only two I could come up with are naming tanks, aircraft, etc., which is kind of an expression of collective will, and then individual names given to rifles. I know, but I'm not sure if that's just a full metal jacket, name your rifle, or give your rifle a girl's name type thing. So is there anything you can say in terms of that?
Absolutely. So when you're looking at the more recent names, there's especially I've been lucky enough that I've had a chance to meet some of the operator guys, and they do talk about weapons being named and weapons sort of being certain models of guns having certain names. But generally what you're seeing there is I don't want to quite say it's a joke, but you're going to see things that are more indicative of something that the gun will have in common with that name. For example, 6 Hour recently won the contract for the U.S. Army to provide surge kits, which are suppressed upper receiver groups, little guns, and they called it kind of the Black Mamba as kind of a joke. You know, it's poisonous, it's a snake, you know, it's fast. You have that sort of idea going on. As for tanks and cannons, unfortunately, I'm more of a small arms guy. I haven't had a chance to look into that. I would absolutely believe it though, and the idea of this collective will, I would believe. But that's as far as I'd be able to comment on that one, unfortunately.
I can probably give you some answers on the 15th century cannons because I've written a lot about them. Yeah. And they're either place names, there are a few place names, or they're women's names. In fact, somebody must have hated Margaret or Crete because there's about a dozen cannons that are named Crete or Margaret, including both one in Edinburgh that was sent over by Burgundians and the one that's in Ghent that was Burgundian. Both of those are originally named Crete. And the only exception to this is Pius II had 3 cannons or that were named after him, Aeneas, Silvius, and Piccolomini, one that was named after his mother Victoria, and 12 that were named after the apostles. I don't know whether that says anything about Pius, but it's kind of an interesting change in tradition as far as the names of cannons in the 15th century are concerned.
I was going to say, it must surely be verging on blasphemy to load a cannonball into one of the apostles there. Not to mention there's about 6 Johns from memory. But
and if they blow up, I mean, what do you do then? Because there's a lot of cannons that just blow up. If Peter blows up, does that go to hell?
So sticking with Eric, we had another one from Anthony Dishard, which is he suggests perhaps a second fork to your phase 1, quite noticeable in tales of mythology, where the prestige and authority of the weapon stems from the maker rather than the wielder. So citing Hephaestus or Vulcan, Wieland, and other examples in Asian or Middle Eastern. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, one quick thing I do want to say real quick. I do have the YouTube chat open on this screen. Mr. Bernard says the M249 is the buzzsaw, if I remember correctly. You were thinking of the MG42, and it was referred to as Hitler's buzzsaw due to it has a very high RPM, and it sounds like a buzzsaw when it's going off. But to this topic, 2 computers messed me up. I would believe that there's a phase 1 where there's the prestige and the authority come from the wielder, but at that point, again, you're looking at this sort of outside authority. I am having the authority here because I have a sword made by Wayland, and you'll actually see that come up kind of on a little bit of a cycle back. There is some interpretations where Joyeuse is actually part of a set of 3 made by Wayland. And it was made with Curtana and Durandal, according to some interpretations I've seen. And they're all being made by Wayland. And that's where you're seeing this sort of authority being brought back in. But it's an outside authority being brought in. It's not something that is magnifying the intrinsic wielder. As for this comment about Asian and Middle Eastern cultures, absolutely, very well could be there. Unfortunately, I'm mostly Western Europe, and I would have to look into it more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just thinking aloud, I do wonder if there's something about manufacture in there, because it's very easy for something which is, you know, handcrafted and very special to give its bearer authority. But once you get into the kind of mass production that I guess, you know, Deschamps is talking about, each object individually becomes just that little bit less special.
Yes, that's and that's fair, and this is something that's absolutely worth looking into more.
We also had a comment from Gurinder. So sea cannons were given various names in Persian. He may get a chance to talk about it in his talk tomorrow, but if he doesn't, he just wanted us to let us know that. So thank you very much, Gurinder, for passing that on. So just looking at the question. So another one, just very quickly to Eric, if that's right. Do named weapons in fiction tend to operate in different ways to their historical counterparts? And he cited, Stuart cites specifically Lord of the Rings, Narsil, Valyrian swords in Games of Thrones.
It depends on who's writing it, is the answer on that one. When you look at, I'm going to speak mostly about Lord of the Rings here, mainly because I have not read Game of Thrones. But when you have someone like Tolkien, who is extremely well versed in names and is a historian and a linguist, he's very careful with his names, and especially when you look at Narsil and Anduril, and you look at this idea of authority, you see that when the blade is broken, the intrinsic authority is gone. The guy is dead, and the blade is broken. So when the sword needs to be brought back and it needs to go to Aragorn, it is reforged, and importantly, it's renamed. You're almost looking at a complete remanufacture of this weapon so that it can do something. It's almost an entirely new idea, an entirely new object, and it's a different source of authority completely. You do see it again. This can get bucked in a couple of different ways. Perhaps the one Gandalf's sword Glamdring is not renamed, and it's just supposed to be from the Fall of Gondolin, I believe, and I cannot remember who wields it off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. But you'll see this dynamic still happening, but it does depend on the writer. Some writers just name things because they like the name, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, just in the interest of keeping the geek out going. So I have read Game of Thrones a few times. I watched the TV series. So I suspect it's probably a more postmodern take on it, because I think Tolkien probably was a bit more serious with the tropes, in that you do get, you know, people value Valyrian swords and they do get reforged, but most of the value is either them practically being very sharp or what people imbue into them. So, you know, people, I'm thinking Oathkeeper here, which is basically one of the main character's swords gets reforged, given to one of the bad guys, quote unquote, and he takes it quite seriously in his obligation. But it's probably more of a postmodern take on the tropes. Kelly, Michael, do you have anything to add?
I couldn't unmute quick enough. Mike actually teaches a class of Tolkien, so I'll let him take this question.
Yeah, I mean, Eric is absolutely right. I mean, you know, when you talk about Tolkien, you know, that this all goes back to his, you know, philological understandings of things, and he's tying this into mythology. Mm-hmm. You know, Lord of the Rings is in a sense supposed to take place in our past. So, you know, the sort of status of what was understood about weaponry and these traditions at the time that Tolkien was writing, you know, between the world wars, that is what you see in Lord of the Rings. You know, so it's tied very specifically to that academic understanding at that time, and it is because it's built out of history and myth. It replicates that, and yeah, Game of Thrones, as you say, Mark. You know. George takes from a lot of places, mm-hmm. And he's definitely building out of Tolkien too. So yeah, George has got that stuff interesting. I mean, you know, Wheel of Time. There's a lot of these these fantasy authors that are pulling this stuff up, and they're basically doing it because Tolkien did it. Tolkien sets the standard, and then everybody's like, all right, well, I got to check that box, and some do it more effectively than others. But it is when you start looking at this, at what they're pulling from, there's a great deal there. Tolkien was drawing from Northern European traditions of this, and that then has sort of replicated throughout, fantasy literature. But we are starting to see fantasy writers who are now pulling from some of the Eastern traditions, or even Southern Mediterranean traditions of these naming practices are different from Northern European traditions. There's a cultural difference here. And that, we focus on the Northern European stuff because it's what is accessible to us so much more. A lot of the Spanish materials and what's happening in more Spain, a lot of that's not translated, and so it's not available to people who can't work in multiple languages, and so we're kind of missing that bit of the picture. And unfortunately, fantasy literature does kind of reflect that. That over-reliance on one tradition rather than another, for better or worse.
George Martin cheats because the best weapon, of course, are flying lizards. And at that point, I was interviewed a lot during the Game of Thrones series, and I always had to end everything by, "Oh, and there are dragons." We forget about that. I mean, Tolkien makes his dragon fallible to a weapon. George Martin says, yeah, we'll just make the dragons more important than anything.
True.
Well, I mean, according to Adam Musk, there were dragons in 14th century England. So, we do have to remember that.
Yeah, fiery dragon was seen in the north this year.
It's not the dragons you need to be worried about. It's the rabbits bearing heshes, unfortunately.
Yes. And Henry Knighton also is a very good historian in late 14th century in England. He has a fiery dragon as well in the north, and clearly believes there's one. So, rabbits with axes. Yeah, what the heck?
The rabbits with the pointy teeth, they're also a problem too. So, yeah.
We're covering every single variant of all the way to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. We've got. I'll end it on one practical point, because we did have a question from Pengworth Saucer King, I believe it is, on YouTube, which is how much. To be fair, it does come back to this question of literary versus accurate depiction. So it is slightly, but effectively, how much do you think that European artists are depicting European sabers as exaggerated or clipped falchions or messes to emphasize their otherness, or because it's the only curved swords that the artists have reference to?
Boy, I've used a lot of artistic depictions recently in works, and especially from this period, depicting what's happening in Italy, as well as France and England and the Low Countries and Spain. And I would say most of them are accurate. Now, there's always a clear, Goliath seems to be they try to do whatever they can, but the Crusades are long out of memory. So there really isn't a contact with what's happening in Islam. So everybody's depicted being the same. And the swords are amazingly accurate, to the point where there are some sculptures in Italy on churches that actually have real swords in their hands. And then the very interesting sculpture of St. George and the Dragon in Stockholm that has a very real lance that is held by the dragon in his paws and is also piercing his skin. So I think that the accuracy of weapons, I think that there wasn't a real need to depict them in fantasy because there were too many people who knew them. It was just a really bellicose society. And so watching, I always think of the late Roman writer Cassiodorus, who is surprised when he sees a Frank with all his weapons. There's nobody in the 14th, 15th century who would be surprised by anybody carrying weapons, even from your lowest peasant up to the top of the king. It just would be so wide to depict them otherwise.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, but we're coming to the end of our time slot, unfortunately. So I'll just ask the speakers quickly. Do you have anything that you want to say or to add? No? Great. Because I was going to say, there have been 2 absolutely fascinating papers, some really great discussion, and thank you very much to coming, because I'm not going to reveal to the audience exactly what time zone it is that each of you are in, but I'll just say that you've made some phenomenal sacrifices to be here. This is the great thing about a virtual event, is that we can bring people that we've wanted to collaborate with for a while and just haven't got the chance. But equally, it does cause quite a bit of hardship on your part. So thank you very much for taking the time to come along. Thank you also to Adam for producing the event behind the scenes. I know you're out there somewhere. And thank you to you, the audience, for taking time out of your day to attend and for all your questions. Hopefully, we've given you something to enjoy. Now, sadly, that's the last of our formal panels for today, although we do have a networking session at 3 o'clock, which I look forward to seeing some of you at. The next panel will be tomorrow morning at 9:30 British summertime, and it'll explore the collecting and documenting of arms and armour. But bear in mind that if you can't join us directly, if you're in New Zealand or elsewhere in the globe that's at a horrendous time zone to get to us, you will have the opportunity to watch the entire conferences again on our YouTube channel. It'll be sorted into nice, helpful panels, and you can go exactly to the one that you're interested in. You won't have the opportunity to participate, sadly, but it's better than nothing. So in the meantime, thank you again for watching, whether you're watching live or if you're watching this video on demand again, and I hope to see you soon.